Infectious disease, history's biggest killer. Responsible for almost 3/4 of all human mortality, disease seems pretty unstoppable. But within the last 50 years or so, things have improved significantly. How were we able to cut down death by that much within just 200 years? Many attribute this sudden change to this: an antibiotic called penicillin. It's commonly used for treating minor infections such as strep throat or meningitis. But the discovery of penicillin, often hailed as the wonder drug, was a breakthrough unlike any other. And not just by itself, this discovery was the catalyst to a golden age of antibiotics, an era that greatly improved life quality and expectancy, and opened up a frontier of medical research not only for infections, but long-term disease. To understand the truly groundbreaking impact of penicillin, we need to go back to the infancy of antimicrobial medicine, starting in ancient Egypt. Compared to other civilizations, an aspect commonly overlooked about the Egyptians was their fairly advanced medicine. While not possessing any knowledge of bacteria or viruses, the ancient Egyptians came up with cures for infection in the form of honey or herbs. But the most effective treatment was a bit more unusual. And although the Egyptians were the first to use it, the cure's earliest documentation can be found in this book. Theatrum Botanicum is a treasure trove of information about biology and medicine, and when its author, John Parkinson, wrote the work in 1640, he coined the term mold therapy. Mold therapy was the aforementioned Egyptian method of applying moldy bread to an infected area, a treatment that works surprisingly well. Mold therapy was the very beginning of antibiotics, remedies that utilize microorganisms to fend off other microorganisms. Of course, that only left the question of why this strange technique worked, and the answer came in the form of tiny microscopic beings, or as called by their discoverer, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, animalcules. And even then, it wasn't until nearly 200 years later, in 1861, that it became known that bacteria and viruses were the definite causes of infections. This was proved through various experiments by Louis Pasteur, a French chemist, who called this germ theory. And with this new discovery, scientists from all over the world started innovating. Strangely enough, the initial discovery of penicillin wasn't intentional. In fact, it was the result of a messy lab, a mistake, and a vacation. Introducing Scottish physician Alexander Fleming. He had been researching pathogens in St. Mary's Hospital when he left his lab unattended for a 2-week vacation in 1928. And often being described as a careless lab technician, he returned to find a white fluffy mass growing in a petri dish he'd left out, with the substance in question rapidly increasing in size. And remarkably, the bacteria in the dish, named Staphylococcus aureus, was starting to disintegrate, a process called lysis. And all this was seemingly due to the strange white mass that Fleming soon identified as Penicillium notatum. So Fleming got to work. He ran some tests and discovered that Penicillium notatum could quickly and reliably quell the spread of many different strains of bacteria, not just the initial specimens he'd observed. This was because penicillin attacked the one thing all bacteria have in common: the peptidoglycan cell wall. This wall protects the bacteria from the outside world, like a microscopic suit of armor. When the penicillin is introduced, however, the wall breaks down. This causes the cell to disintegrate, and as Fleming saw with Staphylococcus aureus, the bacteria then goes through lysis and dies. Penicillium notatum also had an extremely low toxicity level on animals, and most likely humans as well. This put it in a much better position than many of its predecessors, such as salvarsan, an antimicrobial agent discovered in 1910. Although salvarsan was effective in some areas, it was ultimately highly toxic and hard to use. Fleming published his findings in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology in 1929, but with no way to purify penicillin, he couldn't actually distribute it for use by the public, and didn't have the resources to act further on his discovery. So, for years, the discovery that could change the course of medical history lay untouched.
There are a lot of misconceptions about medical research. People sometimes think that I and the others worked on penicillin because we were interested in suffering humanity. I don't think it would ever have crossed our mind.
That was the voice of Dr. Howard Florey, an Australian professor of pathology at Oxford University, and a known master of gathering resources to carry out research. When he came across Alexander Fleming's paper in 1938, he immediately put his resources to use, gathering scientists and labs with the aim of developing penicillin for the public. Florey was aided by a bright scientist named Dr. Ernst Chain, who, having fled from Germany at the cusp of World War II, had seen firsthand how infection could be just as deadly as combat. With their combined effort, they were able to acquire enough promising research to begin testing penicillin on human subjects, and their first attempt was on a 48-year-old police constable, Albert Alexander, who had fallen ill with streptococcus and staphylococcus, both of which could be cured with a new antibiotic. But despite the researchers' best efforts, Alexander ultimately died. The cause? Well, the medicine worked. There just wasn't enough of it. That's what Dr. Norman Heatley, a biochemist, had been working on concurrently to Florey and Chain's experiments. He had set up a makeshift mold factory, constantly attempting to find new ways to purify the mold. Despite his best efforts, it didn't change that the current mold, Penicillin notatum, just couldn't produce large enough amounts of pure penicillin. So, in the summer of 1941, Florey and Heatley set off to America, working with American scientists to find a suitable replacement. But ultimately, it was a lab assistant who brought in the first sample of a new mold she found on a cantaloupe. This new type of penicillin was called Penicillin chrysogenum, and after undergoing some mutation, it was able to produce more than 1,000 times more pure penicillin than Penicillin notatum, the original mold studied by Alexander Fleming. With this new discovery, the first ever civilian patient, Ann Miller, was able to be treated for a blood poisoning infection in March of 1942, and the success of penicillin, or the wonder drug, only skyrocketed from there. By 1945, American pharmaceutical companies were producing over 650 billion units of penicillin per month, and as a part of the war effort, deaths by infection changed from being the main cause of mortality to accounting for less than 1% of military deaths. Furthermore, the mortality rate by infection for the general public lowered to just 4%. But penicillin didn't do all this by itself. In fact, it set into motion the golden age of antibiotics, a frontier of amazing medical innovation that reached a peak in the 50s. With the average lifespan ever increasing due to these advancements in technology, penicillin also opened the doors to another frontier, the study of diseases such as cancer and dementia, medical issues that don't start to affect patients until later in life. By 2013, the mortality rate by communicable disease was reduced to less than 0.5%, all thanks to penicillin, the subsequent golden age of antibiotics, and the amazing improvement in quality of life brought on by it. So, happy ending, right? Not quite. In the summer of 2016, a new bacteria started making the rounds in news headlines, labeled as a superbug.
Drug-resistant superbug.
With superbugs,
does not respond to any of those antibiotics.
That the medical community has long feared.
limited effect of antibiotic.
This superbug was a new strain of E. coli, a bacterial infection that stems from contaminated food or water. But the infection itself wasn't worrying. It was the fact that it couldn't be cured by an antibiotic that was long considered a last resort.
Antibiotics that used to be effective for a lot of common illnesses are, in many cases, no longer effective.
This incident was just one of many cases of bacteria harboring antimicrobial resistance, the ability to resist one or multiple drugs that were designed to fight it.
Like all resources, we must have some sort of effective way to manage those resources. And I think antibiotics fits in that category where it's a finite resource.
This finiteness of antibiotics are what led to antimicrobial resistance. With the treatment being used over and over again, it was only a matter of time before the bacteria evolved to resist it. These superbugs are starting to become a prevalent problem, especially since antibiotic innovation has been slowing down in recent years. In fact, antimicrobial resistance is one of the top 10 global public health threats, as declared by the World Health Organization. All of this poses the question, how can humanity overcome this?
You know, they say we're in an evolutionary race with bacteria. We can't win against bacteria in evolution.
But the future isn't completely bleak. With scientists starting to take notice of the issue, many new technologies have come to bat in the war on bacteria.
There are these viruses called bacteriophages. There's specific viruses that only target bacteria.
With the crisis of superbugs looming over humanity, these solutions add a silver lining. Expanding right before our eyes is a new medical frontier. And as we approach the 100th anniversary of penicillin's discovery, maybe we'll see the birth of a new wonder drug. Because right now, we could really use it.